Good day, everyone. My name is Tony Reeves, and welcome to another edition of In the Know. As you probably have been following on my various videos, I've been spending a lot of time talking about Generation X, particularly Black Generation X. But I realize now that I need to set some context of why this is important and why certain things need to be discussed with regards to our role as being a transitional generation. As you're aware, I just recently completed a series called Traveling While Black Generation X. And so now what I want to talk about is a three-parter, and I'm going to be leading it and talking about a variety of topics. But today we're talking about the journey of Black Generation X. And part of our journey was shaped heavily by the generation that preceded it. And so I want to talk about what it means when you are being raised by a generation that brought with it great progress and great trauma at the same time. Right now, a lot of people are focusing on the fact that whenever we talk about generations, we kind of talk about them in a vacuum. In other words, when we talk about baby boomers or Generation X or millennials and Gen Z, we often look at them through the lens of their specific generation and what they went through during their generation. But what we don't talk enough about is how previous generations shaped those generations. And the way those generations were shaped is usually through the lens of the things that they benefited from in terms of progress, but also from the trauma that they brought with them. And out of every generation, I can tell you, Black Generation X and Generation X as a whole, we literally took on the mantra of ushering in this new world order where we had parents who brought with them tremendous trauma and tremendous progress, and also the tremendous uncertainty of not knowing what this world would look like because they had never seen it before. The reason why I bring this up is because a lot of times there are people who say things like, oh, you're bringing up the past, you're dividing it. If you don't talk about where you came from, you can't talk about where you're going. So when I'm talking about where I came from, I'm talking about the baby boomers or the silent generation or the greatest generation. Because when I came up, those generations were the ones shaping me. Those were my great-grandparents, my grandparents, and my parents. And they brought with them in a variety of different things. They had gone through tremendous trauma and strife. These were people who literally grew up in a world where they had to sit in the back of the bus. My grandfather fought in World War II and was a part of a segregated military. Because remember, the military didn't desegregate until 1948, I believe, which was after World War II had concluded. So he was used to fighting in a military that had him separate and apart from his white counterparts. Literally, my mom's generation and my grandparents, they all grew up in a segregated school system under the heavy thumb and fist of Jim Crow. That was their experiences. But they also came through during a period of great promise and great hope. They were there when we had the Martin Luther Kings and the Malcolm X's. They were there with the John F. Kennedys and the Robert Kennedys. They were there with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense and the Nation of Islam. They had all of those things coming forward. So they were moving both with the trauma on one hand and the positive future of a hope on the other hand. And when those worlds finally converged, there was a lot of resistance, there was a lot of tension, but there was a lot of progress as well. And what happened is that by the time the dust settled, the people who were going to be the direct beneficiaries of that were going to be people who had never experienced any of that. And that would be Generation X. But the other reason why I stress about this is because I want people to understand that people carry these things with them generationally. So when I hear people make these statements about not wanting to bring up the past and dredge the past and dividing us, I have to remind them, you don't have to bring up anything. They brought these things with them. And let me give you a great example. Most of us know about the tragic death of George Floyd in 2020. But think about what happened after his death. In the aftermath of his death, I believe he passed in May of 2020, for the next 3 months, we had global protests, not just protests in the United States, global protests for a good solid 3 months. And then after that, we had various states and even the federal government passing legislation to address the inequities and the harm that was caused during that time period. We are still seeing, and there are still people who are still experiencing the aftermath of that 5 years later from that one singular event. Now, I'm not trying to make George Floyd a martyrdom or any way, shape, or form. What I'm saying is, if that one isolated incident could spark nations around the world and could cause it to such a degree that people carried it, all the residuals that tied into it. And let me just be clear for those people who think I'm oversimplifying. George Floyd amplified an angst that was present in the black community and other marginalized community. And that gave power and rep to a lot of different protests going forward with regards to that. If that one incident happened and we carried it for 5 years, imagine what it was like coming out of the civil rights movement. We're talking about a period of time that 1963, John F. Kennedy was assassinated on television. 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated. Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy were assassinated in 68 in 2 months from each other. And there were nationwide riots when Martin Luther King was assassinated. So over a period of less than 10 years, we had 4 noted leaders who were all pushing towards advancement, all assassinated. And as a result, you saw great upheaval at that time. So it's reasonable to expect that there's going to be trauma from those people who remember that. And also in the same instance, there was great hope. We had the Civil Rights Act of 64. We had the Voting Rights Act of 65. We had fair housing of 68. So you have 2 things going at the same time. This country grappling with violence that took some of our greatest leaders in front of our eyes, while at the same time embracing all of this great legislation that would force the change to destroy the institutions that were separating us. All of this was happening in real time. And you know what wasn't happening? There was not a playbook for how we were to make this thing happen seamlessly. The Band-Aid had been ripped off on both of them. And now we have generations of people. And let's just be clear about it. For all these great changes we had, there were still people who didn't want these changes to happen. They were actively resisting it. So you've got a situation where even though the institutions have changed, even though the agencies have taken a different perspective, even though these things happen, you've got a generation of people, whether it be the silent generation, the greatest generation, or the baby boomers, who are now ushering in a whole new generation of kids who are now going to be a part of a multicultural society while they're carrying the baggage of all of the pain that they had. Now, there was nobody out there actively telling them that they couldn't say something. But the reality is how do you prepare the next generation for this world that they themselves fought so hard to create but had not seen? And that's what we took going into our generation. So then I have to ask this question. How do you prepare your child when you're processing what you just went through? And this is not trying to be disrespectful. Am I telling you that every white child I dealt with was racist? No. But what I'm also saying that there's a very good chance that some of those white children had racist parents. Am I saying that there was every black child there had parents that were jumping up in joy for desegregation? I'm pretty sure there was quite a few black parents who did not want that to occur. But what I'm saying is that they had to balance those worlds. So while I can tell you when I was engaging with a lot of my friends during this time period, I didn't know the backstory for any of them. There was no way for me to know what their backstory was. And because I didn't know what their backstory was, and I didn't necessarily need to know their backstories, there was no way of knowing what information was being filtered to them in a way that may have been to my detriment or to my benefit. Which brings me back to me, respectfully. On June 2nd, 1969, that marked a significant milestone for my mom. On that day, 2 things would happen. On June 2nd, 1969, she would receive her degree in education to be a teacher from the University of Arkansas at Pine Bluff, formerly Arkansas A&M. But also, at 2 o'clock that same morning, she would give birth to me. So 2 things were happening, and her world changed instantly overnight because she went from being a married woman to a mother. But she also went from being a student to an educator. So she had 2 things going in the same time period. She was now getting ready to transition into this brand new world where she not only had to educate future students who may not look like her and who may have had parents who had experiences that were opposite of hers, or even had parents that she had to deal with who may not have even want their children to be around black teachers, but she also had to raise a child in this world as well. And there was no playbook for it. I know it's very easy for us to fall into this trap of saying, stop bringing up the past. But the problem is that once you ignore the past, when you start telling people to not bring it up, what you're effectively telling them is to act as if it didn't happen. And there are those people who are going to say, that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying we don't have to keep bringing it up. And I would look to them and say, what do you mean by keep? Because a lot of these stories we're only hearing for the first time because so many of us, especially Black Generation X and the parents, have internalized what happened. They've taken the pain and said, okay, we're now in this new world. Can we move forward without having to be reminded of the pain? If you hear somebody like me, if you hear a boomer or somebody from the silent generation bring up something, they're not bringing it up because they want to talk about it. They're telling you they're seeing something that reminds them from the past. So the next time somebody brings up something, before you're so quick to open your mouth and tell them that they should stop bringing it up, ask yourself, is there a reason why they're bringing it up? Because if they're bringing it up because it's representative of something that they've seen or something that their parents have seen, maybe take stock and listen to what they're saying and be mindful that this was what they had to deal with going forward. I can't speak for all of my friends who are a member of Black Generation X, but I can tell you from my limited experience, a lot of them had parents who didn't actively share the trauma they went through. They were bastions of hope, and they hoped that we wouldn't go through what they went through, but they were prepared to educate us if we saw something that they had experienced so they could prepare us accordingly.